So, hello everyone. I'm really glad to see you all in these very difficult circumstances. I'm really glad that you're all okay here. Not quite sure that other people, they might find it very difficult to be online as well. Let me introduce our guest lecturer, Chris Cutler. Chris Cutler here on the screen. Hello, Chris. Hi. Okay.
Howdy.
Um, Chris is, I think I have introduced you on the previous lecture. That's a long time ago, 14th of February, that he's a very well-known drummer, actually, and became famous from the band called Henry Cow in the 70s. And I started to work ago, and I invited him as a guest lecturer to UEL for about 7 years now, I think. And in the past several years, we had workshop with students and played Chris's instruction piece called Conspiracies. And we were trying to do that for this year too, and make it public concert. But for these obvious reasons, we can't do anymore. We can't do workshop with you, or we can't do public performance. So instead of that, I was trying to do online performance, but I tried some other platform and I found it difficult. And some students really showing the concerns that they wouldn't be able to join in. So we decided not to do playing together, but we are going to deliver this online lecture with Chris. Chris, I would like you to talk about instruction piece. Why is it good as a collaboration tool? And actually how you discovered it, or what is the sort of inspiration when you do it, that kind of thing.
Okay, well, there's two kinds of music that everybody's really familiar with in terms of the method of its production. There's music that's written down, and there's music that's improvised. And in between, there are things like folk music, which are just remembered. They're not written down and they're not improvised, but they're passed around amongst people. So if you want to make music together, you really have to use one of these three methods. There aren't any others that I can think of. What happened in the 18th and 19th centuries, after music became notated, after what we now call classical music became a dominant form of music, is that there's a big division between musicians who were able to improvise, who could make music up, and musicians who were taught how to read scores and who were very good at reading scores, I mean incredibly good at reading scores instantly, but who actually, if you said, play me a solo, play a cadenza, as they say in classical music, they couldn't really do it. That's not part of their training. So you have this division between, suddenly, which is a new thing, between musicians who are able, let's say, who have a direct contact to the source of music, who can actually produce music out of nothing. They know how to do that. They know how to do that with other musicians together. So you can sit in a room with 5 musicians and they can play something coherent together, which is also true of all folk musicians. But if you get 5 classical musicians and say, make something up, actually, mostly they can't do it, even today. And certainly 50 years ago, you wouldn't find many classical musicians who were improvisers. So in the 1950s, classical music was in a complete standstill because for 50 years it had just been one experiment after another. Yes, because this long period in classical music which is fairly stable. Everybody knows what the rules are and they know how music is written and how you move from one key to another and how you do a resolution. It's a formula. And the formula, every new composer wants to do something new. And anyway, the time is changing, so there are new things to say. And so by the end of the 19th century, classical music was quite complex. The rules were not simple anymore. For instance, the first 10 minutes of pieces, which piece am I thinking of? Tristan and Isolde is no key. You don't know what key it's in because it's just floating around. So you have a crisis in the composed side of music. The improvised side of music, which has always existed in villages and amongst folk musicians, suddenly takes a big step forward because black slaves in America who still had very strongly their roots in the music of their own countries, which was not written down, which was all to do with understanding rules and being able to produce music, were suddenly, because of recording technology, spreading their kind of music, which was jazz, blues, through the medium of recording. So suddenly you have a field, which is the field of recording, where these two worlds come back together. Because as far as the record is concerned, it doesn't care what's on the record. So a record is just a flat piece of, well, now it's plastic, and then it was, well, various things through time. And so you get in this field, in the public domain, instead of in the village or in the small closed community, in the public domain, you start to get music circulating which is not written. And you start to have people working in music who are improvisers. And improvisation, especially through jazz, becomes a really important means of producing music. So in the 1950s, when recording was not a novelty, but actually it was the main medium that music circulated through, by the 1950s, everybody was buying records and listening to music on records. In the classical world, you have various strands because the old rules of classical music have gone. The old conditions of classical music have gone because that was a world before sound recording. That was a completely different universe in which the concept, the understanding of sound in the public was completely different. I mean, already at the turn of the century, people like Russolo had introduced the idea of noise as a substitute, but as a form of music, so that all sound should be used in music and not just conventional instrument sounds. And so throughout the 20th century, the classical music world, or the ex-classical musical world, but the world of composition, started to include all kinds of extended techniques, all kinds of strange sounds, as well as abandoning key systems and questioning tuning systems and employing rhythmical devices which are completely alien to the classical music tradition. Graphic scores and instruction scores really emerge as a serious medium in the 1950s and early 1960s. As far as I know, you could say that Luigi Russolo, the Italian futurist, probably invented graphic scores in the way that we understand them, because his instruments didn't have any pitches, they just made noises. So he would draw graphic lines to indicate whether the noises were to rise or to fall in pitch and volume and so forth. And if you go all the way back to the beginning of musical writing in Western culture, all the neumes, as they were called, this is before stave notation was invented. They were also just lines that indicated up, down, relative pitch. So composers come from a tradition in which improvising is the opposite of what they do. Cage, for instance, who might have been extremely experimental as a composer and who actually destroyed formal composition in the course of his lifetime and his work, nevertheless hated improvisation. He really didn't like improvisation. And graphic scores were invented as a way of getting a group of musicians to play together without actually having to make music up, because musicians in the classical and contemporary musical world want to be told what to do. That's what they've been taught. They've been taught to follow instructions. So if you were to get a string quartet and say just improvise, then A, you don't have a job anymore, and B, musicians are making the music themselves. You don't need composers, you don't need conductors, you don't need anybody, you don't need that structure anymore, because musicians can just make it up as they go along. But then you lose everything that you've gained through composition, because composition produces really extraordinary kinds of structure and effects, which you find very hard to do if you're improvising. So the most avant-garde composers found themselves in a situation in which the musicians that they worked with were not able to improvise, and so they needed some kind of instructions that were not actual notes and actual periodicities and quavers and crotchets and durations and rhythms, because they didn't want to produce music with durations and rhythms and pitches. They wanted access to the world of noise, of sound. So they needed some way of indicating, of giving a safety net as well as an indication to the performers what sort of things they were supposed to do, when they were supposed to do them, and how it was supposed to work. And there were several schools of graphic scoring. Cage is one of the most prominent, and for him, time was the most important factor. So you'll see graphic scores which are a sheet of paper with squiggly lines on, and sometimes some straight lines and sometimes some blobs, and they're organized in a particular way. The composer will usually have a list of instructions for the performers to say roughly how you interpret the squiggles and how you interpret the blobs, and obviously your interpretations have to be consistent. So when you see a blob, you have to do a blob thing and not a squiggle thing. So you are actually following the instructions, you are following orders. What Cage did, which was interesting, was to find a way of scoring in which there were no squiggles or blobs, there were just lengths of time. So he would say, you work with a stopwatch between this marked time and that marked time, you do X. And X would be whatever the score told you you had to do. So, for instance, in one of the pieces, the performers are instructed to build themselves a library of 12 different sounds or types of sounds or ways of playing. And then the score simply shows a start time and a stop time and a number, 6, 5, 11, whatever. When you see the number 11, you do whatever your sound or your behavioral thing is for number 11. So I don't need to go on with the history of graphic scores, but so you can see that on the one hand, a graphic score is a visual thing where you're giving visual information and you have to interpret it. And in some of the Cage pieces, it's less of a visual thing than a set of instructions, really. It's an instruction piece. It's not, you don't interpret the graphic score graphically. You read the graphic score as a set of instructions. So Cage will say between 1 minute 30 and 2 minutes 20, you can start anywhere you like during that time, and you start with instruction 8. And sometime between 3:20 and 4:30, you can stop. So you have a lot of flexibility. And when you have 8 or 9 people, all with different pages of the same score, so different start times and finish times, and they have their own set of 12 different sounds. When you put it all together, you get a piece which is organized. Musicians have to stop. This is the most important thing about all of these kinds of scores, is that it prevents people from playing all the time. They have to stop and they have to start at particular times. So what you have there already is a grid, is the structure. And the structure is inflexible. So the composer is justifying his compositional role by providing the musicians with structure and with a limit of options. It limits their options. So if you can only use 12 kinds of sound, then that you can only use those 12 kinds of sounds. But he's not telling you what the sounds are. This is up free. You can have anything in your palette of sounds. So this means the composer can't control the sound of the result. He doesn't know what sounds or what activities any of the musicians will be performing. He only knows when they're going to happen. So the reason, and this tradition comes from composed music, it comes from classical music. Improvisers don't use graphic scores, or when they do, they got the idea from the contemporary composers. And pop musicians don't use graphic scores, they don't need to, and if they do, it's because they've picked it up from the classical musicians. And if they do, the reason for doing it, and the reason that some improvisers do it, and some rock groups actually do it, I mean, Frank Zappa did a lot of, not graphic scores, but he did a lot of conduction, where he would have a very large and complicated set of signals that he could make and numbers and so forth, which would tell the musicians to do something pre-arranged. And he could then make them do whatever he wanted by pointing at them and conducting, and then they would carry on doing what they're doing, and he'd point at somebody else and give them a different number, and so it exists in all forms of music. And the reason that people use it is precisely because you don't want improvisation, pure, because often what happens in improvisation pure is that everybody plays all the time and there isn't much structure. It's fun, and when you have people who are really good at it, it can be very disciplined and organized. but you can't get certain sorts of effect. For instance, sometimes a bunch of improvisers will just all stop together and then all start together. Sometimes good ones. But if you want things like that to happen, or you want it to suddenly get very quiet or suddenly get loud, or you want some people to be very loud and other people to be very quiet, so that when the loud people suddenly stop, you hear the quiet people coming up that you didn't notice were there before. So for all these kinds of effects, you need structure. And a way of getting structure without having to compose all of the parts is to design different kinds of graphic score. And the graphic score may be to tell people what to do, or it may be to tell people when to do, or it may be to designate, specific kinds of effect, like everybody plays high notes, everybody plays low notes, everybody plays glissandi, everybody plays staccato, and so on. So you can therefore put staccato effects on top of glissando effects. So you are composing. You're not getting musicians to do what they would do if they were just left to their own devices. Because in order to improvise like a graphic score, a performer has to constantly think. So for instance, you're improvising with people, and you say, okay, I'm enjoying myself, I'm going to stop. I'm just going to leave a big space. And then in the big space, you think, what might be interesting would be sharp punctuations while other people are doing what they're doing. And you might attract the attention of two other musicians in the group and make a sign to them, and then you all go bap, bap together while other people do. So these are the sorts of things musicians can do which start to produce the kind of structure that a graphic score could produce. But the graphic score can do it much better, and it can do it much more accurately, if that's what you want. Some people use graphic scores like Cage only to produce empty structure. But some people use graphic score to produce very specific effects, like high notes, low notes, just so. And the reason I started to use a graphic score was when I was at certain kinds of event where there were a lot of musicians playing in the space of 2 days, most of whom are pretty experienced improvisers, some of whom are not, and where it seemed like a good idea, since you had all of these people together in, say, Rome, for 2 days, and they'd probably never all be in the same room together again. It's only going to happen once. It would be a waste of an opportunity not to have them all play together. And you can just say, well, we'll all just improvise. Or it might be more interesting if you produce some kind of big structure, some meta structure, and then let people fill it in. So the conspiracies piece, for instance, was generated for a festival in Bologna, where a large number of really great musicians were all gathered together. And it was adapted for more educational purposes later, because scores like this... Hello? Oh. Scores like this are a good training for people. I mean, it's actually quite a good way of stepping. If you're in the improvising world, it's a way to step into the world of scores and instructions and doing what you're told. And if you're in the written music interpretation world, it's a good way of stepping in to the improvisation world. And you can bring the two worlds together with a graphic score because all skills are included. Does that answer your question?
Again, um, So let me explain about it